to get to all of them. So this is our final event for One Book, One Beaverton 2021. Although we weren't able to have events in person this year, we were still able to make connections, have meaningful conversations, and celebrate Bryan Stevenson's powerful memoir, Just Mercy, virtually. And we have all of you to thank for that. So thanks so much for your support of and engagement with One Book. We would also like to thank the new friends of the Beaverton City Library for their continued generous support of this program. And last but not least, a big shout out to the many staff at the library and at the city who helped make all of this possible. And now for our main event, let me introduce Bobbin Singh. He is the founding executive director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. He served on the board of directors for the ACLU of Oregon from 2011 to 2017 and is currently a member of the Oregon Council on Civil Rights. Welcome, Bobbin.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for hosting me. So please let me know if there's any technical issues or if you can't hear me or anything like that. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I think this is a very important event, this month-long series around Bryan Stevenson's book, and just excited to be able to be here and be able to speak as the concluding keynote, but also just excited because, as I was mentioning prior to the start of this conversation, Bryan Stevenson and his mentor, Stephen Bright from the Southern Center for Human Rights, both Bryan Stevenson Equal Justice Initiative and Southern Center for Human Rights were a tremendous inspiration for both my career and the work that I do. And so to be able to speak at the end of this event and talk about his book or talk about some of the messages in his book is really an honor for me. I think tonight's conversation and this month-long conversation around Bryan's book couldn't be more timely. We're in the midst of a national uprising around racial justice that was ignited in part by the murder or lynching of Mr. George Floyd. And as a country and as a state, we're faced with this simple question at this point. Will we confront white supremacy and its manifestation in our society? And that's a big and daunting question that we're confronted as in this generation. Will we be the generation that actually confronts this value system, this original sin, and this ideology that has permeated and manifested itself in so many of our social structures, including the criminal justice system and mass incarceration? Will we be the generation that actually faces it, confronts it, and engage in the difficult task of dismantling it? My name is Bobin Singh. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And before I dig into my talk, I really just want to introduce you to the Oregon Justice Resource Center and tell you about the work we're doing here in Oregon, a little bit of an overview of the criminal justice system, and use that as a way to help set the table for tonight's talk and discussion. The Oregon Justice Resource Center is a statewide Oregon nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We believe that mass incarceration is, in fact, the greatest civil rights issue of our time, and that we must all take ownership of it. We have over 5,000 jails and prisons in the US. This is the most comprehensive and elaborate infrastructure of incarceration and punishment the world has known, period. And not only do we have 5,000 prisons and jails, we have all the related infrastructure and resources to support this detention system. It is by far the greatest infrastructure, greatest resources that have been dedicated to detention that in the modern world has ever known. We have invested in mass incarceration from slavery until today at the cost of everything else. And I think Bryan's book does a wonderful job of sort of illustrating how mass incarceration surfaces and reveals itself in so many different ways in our society. But if we were just to take a look at news articles and reports about Oregon's criminal legal system from the past year, we would find that individuals, communities, and families directly impacted by our criminal legal system confront racial bias, discriminatory sentencing practices, state violence, and intentional and overly punitive collateral consequences. Oregon is not an exception. Mass incarceration is a national phenomenon and value system, and Oregon is not accepted from that phenomenon. While Oregon does do many things well, there are aspects of our criminal legal system that we must change and transform. According to reports, we incarcerate Blacks at a far higher rate than Florida and Alabama, and nearly twice the rate of Georgia and Mississippi. Until 2020, Oregon incarcerated youth at a higher rate than Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. We were in the minority of states that automatically prosecuted youth as adults for certain crimes, or under Measure 11 crimes, as many of you may know it. That only changed in the 2019 legislative session. We were one of the only states aside from Louisiana that allowed for non-unanimous jury convictions for felonies. This was up until last year. And the list goes on and on and on. Our criminal legal system infringes deeply on the health and equity of our communities, and all of those who reside in Oregon are in one way or another affected by these problems created and sustained by this system of mass incarceration. And I think nothing highlights that more or crystallizes that more than what we've seen during the pandemic, in which we've seen the largest workplace outbreaks be prisons. Over 3,300 individuals inside our prison system have caught COVID, over 41 deaths. Over 700, maybe 800 staff have caught COVID. COVID does not respect or stay within the confines of our prisons, but go back and forth from the communities in which these workers come. So when we say that incarceration impacts us and impacts our communities, this to me is probably the most clear example of how that happens. And I just want to be clear about our criminal justice system and our system of mass incarceration, or just generally our legal system. We operate a discriminatory and wealth-sensitive legal system where those at the margins are always in the crosshairs. So I want to repeat that just one more time. We operate a discriminatory and wealth-sensitive legal system where those at the margins are always in the crosshairs. This sickens our community, our state, and our nation. For individual rights to have any meaning, we must protect them for everyone without exception. I co-founded the OJRC in 2011, and as I mentioned, it was inspired by the work of Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. The OJRC is a family of unique programs addressing unmet needs for legal services and advancing criminal justice reform. Our clients are currently and formerly incarcerated individuals, or those individuals who have been harmed by state actors or the system. And we provide our legal services at no cost to the client. That is, that we do our work completely pro bono. The OJRC uses client-centered and integrative advocacy as its approach to criminal justice reform. This means we promote the rights and liberties of all justice-involved Oregonians by working to change unjust laws and practices through litigation, policy reform, communications, public education, strategic partnerships with like-minded organizations, and generally just whatever we think of community organizing and advocacy to the extent that we can. We operate 5 unique statewide projects providing legal services to currently and formerly incarcerated individuals on a range of issues. We represent individuals who are wrongfully convicted through the Oregon Innocence Project. We provide legal support and services to non-citizen clients who have been arrested. And we have immigration attorneys that assist public defenders so non-citizen clients can understand the consequences on their immigration status of arrest or conviction. And we try to work with the public defenders to negotiate a plea to give individuals the best chance for people to stay in the country. We operate a youth justice program in which we focus on the adult treatment of youth in our criminal legal system. We operate a women's justice project in which we provide civil, non-criminal legal services to women inside Oregon's women's prison, We have basically run a legal aid clinic inside Oregon's women's women prison. And we have a civil rights project in which we represent individuals who have been harmed by state actors. So we represent individuals and family members who have lost loved ones to police violence or misconduct. Those individuals in our jails and prisons around conditions of confinement or treatment. We're the only legal organization in Oregon that's involved in all aspects of the criminal legal system in some shape, way, or form, from arrest through reentry. And this allows us to have a unique perspective as to the experiences of people going through the system or who have been harmed by the system. Through the lenses of our projects and the population the OJRC serves, we work to ensure fairness, accountability, and evidence-based practices are always the foundation of our criminal justice system. And I want to emphasize that we are a client-centered organization. This distinguishes us from some of the other organizations that may exist in our space because first and foremost, we advocate for our clients' interest, but we use the experience of representing our clients to inform our systemic advocacy or our policy reform issues or public education work that we do. But it's always grounded in the client experiences and what we're seeing with our clients. In addition to the Direct Services Project, the OJRC works on issues such as sentencing reform, eliminating racial and ethnic disparities, and repealing the death penalty. And you can learn more about our work at our website at ojrc.org. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to be here with you tonight and grateful to the Beaverton Library for hosting this month-long discussion, because across the country, we're fighting for what I believe is the soul of this country. We're starting to question as a society and a nation who we criminalize, who we incarcerate, and how we punish. Moreover, I believe we're only now starting to really confront the shameful legacy of slavery and white supremacy. What I'd like to do first is to encourage us to move away from the narrow, reductionist approach that has dominated the conversation around many of these issues that are being discussed and move us to a broader analysis so that we can move forward as a community and we can become more effective at frustrating white supremacy and laws rooted in this ideology. We have too often talked, written, and discussed the events of today by reducing it to specific actors or isolated aspects of the system that are born of bigotry and prejudice, but disconnected from the greater story and context. We end up viewing the problem and issues as narrow policies that need to be changed or dismantled, and not as something that is merely a symptom of a greater problem and just a minor component of the structures of social control based on race that has existed and evolved throughout the past 2 centuries. So I want to start with a few definitions, and these are all taken from writing and lectures by Brian Stevenson, Michelle Alexander, Eric Ward, who's a local advocate, Ibram Kendi, and Coates, among others. And for those of you who have been participating in this month-long discussion, my guess is that you have encountered these terms and this conversation as well. So hopefully this will be just a reminder or building on that knowledge that you've been able to gain over the past month. Racism. Racism is a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. Racial inequity is when 2 or more racial groups are not standing on equal footing. A racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequity between racial groups. By policy, I mean written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, regulations, and guidelines that govern people. A racist idea. A racist idea is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another racial group in any way. Racist ideas argue that the inferiorities and superiorities of racial groups explain racial inequities in society. White supremacy. White supremacy is a system of exploitation that was created to build American society. An ideological construction built on 3 things: genocide and stolen resources of Native Americans, exploitation of free labor, Black labor specifically through slavery, and control of sexuality, not just women, but primarily women. White supremacy is about exploitation It is about white people believing fundamentally in white superiority. White people have been socialized in this country to understand that they are superior. And that is what we're really fighting against, that culture. Now, this is in contrast to white nationalism. White nationalism is about ethnic cleansing, envisioning a country free of people of color. Anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. Anti-Semitism is centered in white nationalism. White nationalism, while it may be fringe or once thought of as fringe, we consistently see how these ideologies penetrate the mainstream society and policy. We see how it influences our conversation of who is American, who belongs in America, and who has the ability to fully participate. And we must understand that the distance between the margins and mainstream are just a few steps. And I think this is something that's become very apparent over the past 4 years. The very fuel that drives white nationalism and supremacy is a conversation we have been and are still unwilling to have within the civil rights and criminal justice space, and specifically how the legal system and our justice system sustains and emboldens these ideologies. We have been and continue to be in a serious denial about how insidious and pervasive these ideologies are in our society. Currently, there are persistent and unforgiving attacks on tribal sovereignty, an unwillingness to confront racism, and an unwillingness to frustrate misogyny. These all allow the ideology of white supremacy to fester and grounds the country's systems and, unfortunately, its moral compass. It's also our unwillingness to confront anti-Semitism that presents one of the biggest challenges and weaknesses of our country. How does anti-Semitism function in our society, and how does it fuel white nationalism? White nationalism is a movement that has been growing and animated the events on January 6th, and that was something that we all saw on full display. It plays off bigotry. At its core, it's not necessarily about spreading hate, but it's about building power, about building political power to control the state. Most especially since the civil rights movement, which was a direct attack on white supremacy, we've witnessed the rise of white nationalist movements. This country and the dominant culture had to reconcile the flaws in its core ideology of white supremacy, that white people are inherently superior, and the loss they experience because of the civil rights movement. Here's where we see anti-Semitism and the othering being centered in a way to explain and blame and explain what happened. That there are other forces at a conspiratorial level who are responsible for the losses. This is also the time we see the rise of mass incarceration as a social structure that began in the latest iteration of white supremacy, from slavery to Jim Crow, lynching to mass incarceration. It's all a part of this thread that's connected to this ideology. And once we began to understand this othering that really emerged after the civil rights movement and anti-Semitism, how it animates white nationalism, then we began to understand the driving forces that are pushing these social systems and driving these social systems. And I mention all this just to help contextualize what's happening. And I know much of you already know this, have been familiar with this, and that you've been discussing this, but I think it's incredibly important to understand like how these are all connected and sort of the ideology that's pushing mass incarceration. Saying this out loud and openly without hesitation, it becomes easier to understand why we must reject it as an ideology. And then moving forward by understanding how we're complicit in sustaining these structures of white supremacy and helping the white nationalist movement, that we can engage in actions that are more decisive and effective without moral ambiguity or equivocation. So now I want to pivot to kind of a history of Oregon, because when we began to talk about reforms or any type of structural changes to our legal system, we have a tendency to begin to think about it as a policy that we need to change, that emerged in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s that we need to undo. But we actually don't ever really fully appreciate its connection to the founding principles of this state. And I know there was probably, I think, a wonderful conversation that you had on how Oregon was founded as sort of like a white-only state. And I think, it's something that I think people are becoming more understanding and more accepting of that history. But I just want to talk a little bit about it as we continue. So in 1844, the provisional government of the territory passed a law banning slavery. But at the same time, it required any African American in Oregon to leave the territory. Any Black person would be flogged publicly every 6 months until that person left. This was known as the Lash Law. Soon after, it was deemed too harsh. Its provision for punishments are reduced to forced labor. In 1848, Oregon's provisional government passes the first exclusion law in the Oregon County, in the Oregon Territory, forbidding Blacks to settle in Oregon. From 1848 to 1879, again, when we start talking about white supremacy, we're talking about that trilogy of racism, specifically against Black and the exploitation of labor. Again, the attacks on sovereignty of the Native community, and again, misogyny. So from 1848 to 1879, there's 3 decades of continuous conflict between whites and Native tribes until the tribes were removed from their land, from their ancestral homes, and confined to reservations. In 1850, the Oregon Donation Land Act, enacted by the US Congress to promote homestead settle in the Oregon Territory, it granted free land to whites and half-breed Indians in the Oregon Territory. Quote, the language of the act prevents non-whites from claiming land in Oregon, even if they already settled here. In 1851, the only person known to have been kicked out of the Oregon Territory because of his skin color. In 1854, we see the exclusion laws are repealed. In 1856 and 1857, pro-slavery separatists attempt to create a new state and territory in Southern Oregon. In 1856, the Silet and Grand Ronde reservations are created. In 1857, Oregon adopted a state constitution that banned Black people from coming to the state and residing in the state or holding property in the state when that state entered the Union. In 1859, Oregon becomes a state and explicitly forbade Black people from living in its borders, the first and only state to do so. In 1860s, Asian migration, primarily Chinese, due to mine and railroad work, and Mexican miners also began migrating. So we started to see migration and movement of other nationalities into Oregon. In 1862, Oregon adopts a law requiring all Blacks, Chinese, Hawaiians, and mixed race individuals residing in Oregon to pay an annual tax of $5. In 1865, the Civil War ends. In 1866, Oregon did not ratify the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, until 1973. Oregon actually ratified the amendment in 1866, rescinded it in 1868, and then finally ratified it in 73. Oregon did not ratify the 15th Amendment, which gave Black people the right to vote, until 1959. Technically, after 1868, while Black people could enter the state, culturally, it was very clear that Oregon was a white-only state. In 1877, the Nez Perce tribe and the US Army clashed, and the Nez Perce, led by Chief Joseph, ultimately surrendered. In 1879, the Indian boarding school was founded, second in the nation. These schools were designed to assimilate, quote unquote, assimilate Native children into white culture. In 1880, we had an increase of migration of Chinese to the Pacific Northwest. In 1882, nationally, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act passed. In the 1890s, we began to see an increase of Japanese migration. In 1910, we saw Oregon ranked as high as 7th among states outside the Southwest with Mexican-born migrant workers. So we began to see this influx of new demographics, new people coming into Oregon at this time. And what we began to see is this pushback against that, both nationally, but also in Oregon. In 1919, Portland Board of Realty approves Code of Ethics prohibiting realtors and bankers from selling property in white neighborhoods to people of color or providing mortgages. And I'm not going to go through all the way through the 20th century. I'm just highlighting some of these things that were, I think, key and setting Oregon's sort of culture and value system, and why that history is important, because it's connected to what we're experiencing today. In the 1920s, Oregon experienced a rise in the KKK. In fact, Oregon had the highest per capita Klan membership in the country. The presence was very public and integrated with political power. There were an estimated 14,000 to 20,000 members. In 1923, the Oregon state legislature, dominated by members of the Klan, passes a number of restrictive laws. The alien law, land law prevents first-generation Japanese Americans from owning or leasing lands. The Oregon business restriction law allows cities to refuse business licenses to first-generation Japanese Americans. 1926, Oregon repealed its exclusion laws. The Black population significantly increased after World War II, residing in Vanport. This is an important history that I can't go into all today, but it's an incredibly rich history and an important history to understanding how Portland has evolved over the past later half of the 20th century. And I would encourage, if you're not familiar with that history, to check out the library and see what you can find, because I think it's very critical for us to understand that history, to understand how Portland is currently. Post World War II, we see the push and pull of the state as it battles the advancements being made by the civil rights movement. Hence the understanding that Oregon was built to be a white utopia, a sentiment that drives many of the far-right elements in the Pacific Northwest and in Portland. Portland is the whitest big city in America, with a population that's about 72% white. Every metric shows clearly how the BIPOC community is underserved and relegated to second-class status in Oregon. And that is intentional and rooted in this history of the state. Because as we see, that intention, that value system of believing certain people are inferior, these laws then are created to codify that. And as we began to push past the civil rights movement, we began to see the laws being used to then criminalize these populations in the era of mass incarceration. The totality and brutality of white supremacy cannot be overstated. In all of this mix, Oregon has evolved, but never has really confronted this history. And I'll again emphasize the way in which these issues, criminal justice, housing, education, and so on, have been reduced prevents us from being able to appreciate the destructive ideology of white supremacy and how it fits into the bigger picture. It has prevented us from actually confronting it, frustrating it, and moving forward. We need to confront and reckon with our history of racial injustice. From the death penalty to the killing of George Floyd, these are just symptoms of a largest sort of pernicious tumor that exists in our society. And if I could leave you with one thing today, is that we mustn't be complicit by reducing our conversation to avoid the discomfort and challenges that come from acknowledging and dealing with white supremacy. We mustn't allow our pride from preventing to accept our own complicity in sustaining these structures of white supremacy. It's only by being honest, truthful, we will ever really be able to move to actions that truly result in reconciliation. And as Brian Stevenson notes, truth and reconciliation are sequential and not something that happens simultaneously. Too often we want to move to efforts of reconciliation without ever confronting the truth. And the truth is, our country and our state were founded on the ideology of white supremacy. That many of the policies and practices in our country and our state are rooted in this ideology. We've actually never confronted this reality or fully assessed the extent to which this founding ideology influences the way in which our systems of power have been constructed and how that ideology has impacted the distribution of political and economic power. We have never really honestly addressed all the damage that was done during the 2.5 centuries during which we removed, displaced, killed, enslaved, and subjugated Black and brown people. The great evil of American slavery and Native genocide was not involuntary servitude or the destruction of people, but it is the fiction that Black and brown individuals are not as good as white people, that they are not equal to white people. They are less involved, less human, less capable, less worthy, less deserving than white people. This ideology of white supremacy is what white Europeans and Americans used to justify the conquering and building of America to what it is. The dominant culture needed this ideology to justify the racial, ethnic, and religious hierarchy that exists in the United States. Brian Stevenson's book and work presents very clearly and artfully how our long criminal justice policies and practices are fueled by this ideology. Brian and many public intellectuals have eloquently connected the dots for us with ample evidence to show how this founding ideology has manifested itself throughout the country's history in various forms of social control, from slavery to segregation to mass incarceration, and throughout the history of this country and currently, how Black and brown individuals have been kidnapped, murdered, hanged, beaten, and brutalized. There's an experience and a trauma that exists that we've never fully recognized or even accepted accepted as an experience that people have had. If we accept this very well supported and persuasive argument and broaden our view, we begin to see and accept that many of the driving ideologies and principles of our criminal legal system is directly connected to that ideology of white supremacy and plays a supporting and vital role in accomplishing the goals of the white nationalist movement. Importantly, if we're going to confront this truth, then we must be willing to accept how most of the current policies in our legal system sustain this racial and social hierarchy. While other speakers this past month in this series have spoken to specific issues or policies, none of the issues and how the laws have changed through our courts, changed through our courts, we cannot divorce that history and the political cultural context in which it has and continues to exist. In fact, that too often is what occurs. And that is what poses as an impediment to changes in addressing the harms the BIPOC community experiences. We cannot understand these present issues without understanding the persistent refusal by this country and state to view Black and brown individuals as equal. We cannot understand our current conversation without understanding the history of racial terror and violence that accompanied the evolution of white supremacy in the United States. And we cannot truly understand our criminal justice system without being truthful about that history. So what does mass incarceration look like today? To put it simply, there's a broad awakening and soul searching happening in this country to criminal and racial justice issues. And the question is no longer an issue of left versus right, but it's those who want more punishment versus those who want real effective solutions. It's those who recklessly and excessively react to societal problems by oversimplification and stereotypes versus those who embrace science and evidence-based practices to confront our society's complex challenges. It's those who cling relentlessly to the fear-based rhetoric and values of the tough on crime and law and order era of the 80s and 90s versus those who recognizes that the orientation has shifted towards an approach to public safety that rejects the notion that our criminal justice system should be used to confront and resolve complex socioeconomic and public health issues. We're now in a moment where it's those who recognize that we're in an era of mass incarceration versus those who are simply on the wrong side of history. It's important to acknowledge that what we're doing is not normal, that the caging of humans in the manner and scale we're doing it is not normal. We are 5% of the world's population, but have 25% of the world's prisoners. This is unexampled in modern human history. There are more people under correctional control or supervision that were in the Gulag under Stalin. There are more Black men in prison, jail, or probation, or parole than were enslaved in the 1850s. Here's some other numbers. Roughly 2.3 million incarcerated, 80 million with a criminal record. In Oregon, we have about 15,000 incarcerated, between usually like 12,900 to 15,000, and 80,000 under some form of correctional control. The total population of those confined in a facility in the United States would be the second largest city in the United States. The scale and brutality of our criminal legal system are the moral scandal of our society. We will look back in horror that we allowed this to persist in the same way we look back in shame and disgust at slavery, apartheid, Jim Crow, Native genocide and displacement, the Holocaust, and Japanese incarceration during World War II. As mentioned, we must do a better job of connecting institutional racism and the shameful legacy of bigotry and prejudice of our past to our current policies. They are connected. And until we recognize and accept that straight line that exists from our criminal justice system and policies like the death penalty, stop and frisk, broken windows policing, juvenile life without parole, mandatory minimums, cash bail and the like to white supremacy, We will only continue to take tiny steps and call them major. Our adherence to incrementalism has resulted in failure. We're currently fighting the same fundamental battles that we were fighting during the mid-20th century. Intervening in our criminal justice system by attacking the policies that currently sustain it means fundamentally attacking the structures of white supremacy. In this moment in time, we must unapologetically lead with creativity and innovation. We must openly acknowledge the failures of our criminal legal system and act with urgency on that awareness. We need to discard our adherence to incrementalism and with confidence and unapologetically embrace radical transformation and bold ideas rooted in dignity and compassion and respect. And I want to give one example as I'm winding up. All objective evidence and direct and anecdotal conclude that the death penalty is a failed policy. It does not deter crime. We sentence to death the mentally ill or individuals with intellectual deficits. 2/3 of Oregon's death row exhibits such characteristics. In Oregon, no case has made it through the complete appeals process, and there's currently a 60% reversal rate. That is, 6 out of every 10 cases are reversed on appeal for constitutional errors. More significantly, the failure rate of Oregon's death penalty is 100%. No one has been executed who has not volunteered or given up their appeals. Since 1984, Oregon has executed 2 individuals in the 1990s who volunteered to be executed. Yet no stakeholder actually responds to this evidence in a way, in my opinion, that's rational. District attorneys do not have to seek the death penalty. They can choose not to seek it, but they are not. The Department of Justice here in Oregon which defends death cases on appeals, could offer to settle every case to life without parole, but they do not. The governor could commute every sentence to death to life without parole, but she does not. All these actors ignore the clear and overwhelming evidence of dysfunction, but continue to spend millions of dollars to sustain the fiction and charade of the death penalty in Oregon. And I use the death penalty as an example how, in my opinion, we regularly ignore objective, common sense evidence and how system stakeholders are currently responding to what I can only describe as the patently absurd. But this analysis could be applied to many of our criminal justice policies. If we were to imagine a justice system that was fair and equitable, and stakeholders that were responding in that way, DAs would not seek the death penalty. The AG would immediately settle cases, or the governor would immediately commute in entire death row. So how do we create change, true culture change? We can't do this alone. To achieve change, it will take all of you and many more to accomplish this radical revolution in values and to create a new justice system that has an overriding loyalty to the well-being of all in our community. So I'm asking you for the following. First, we must reject the politics of fear and anger and those who peddle in it. We must begin to push past the vernacular and language of fear and anger and not allow ill-informed reactions to create destructive policies. We must no longer be bullied and intimidated by those who have for so long used this to silence our voices or obstruct meaningful reforms. And we must call these individuals out and reject the premise that public safety and the values of compassion and dignity are mutually exclusive. We must push back against the journalism that sensationalizes and plays on the racist and bigoted stereotypes of poverty, communities of color, immigrants, and those others on the margins. And finally, we must reject the oversimplification of complex societal problems, and more importantly, reject the oversimplification of people. We are all complex. We are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. And it's time for our justice system to reflect this basic truth. How we punish and how we treat individuals who we criminalize, charge, or convict with crimes is more a reflection of us than a statement about the individuals we're punishing. To put it another way and more directly, by looking at our justice system, we can find the clearest and most unfiltered understanding of our values as a society. By all metrics, we are broken. Now, a few years ago, and some folks who heard me speak before have heard me say this before. I had the opportunity to speak at an interfaith gathering to discuss the concept of the beloved community, a term Dr. King used. And the request for me was to talk about the beloved community and what we're doing to create it here in Oregon. And in closing, I just want to share these thoughts with you because reflecting on this concept continues to allow me greater clarity and insight into the work that we're doing here in Oregon. The term beloved community is powerful. If we break it down, it has within it the most beautiful, powerful words and concepts that I think exist in our society: love and community. The core principles of love include compassion, dignity, and respect. And the core principles of community include loyalty to each other and a steadfast commitment to each other's well-being. However, when we look at our justice system, what we find is a very deliberate and intentional removal of these principles. When we look for compassion, we instead find vengeance. When we look for dignity, we instead find inhumanity. When we look for respect, we find brutality and humiliation. When we assess our loyalty and commitment to the well-being of our fellow community members who are justice involved, what we find instead is abandonment and deliberate indifference. If we're to have an honest understanding of our values of society, we only need to look at our justice system. In all evidence, as I mentioned, necessarily concludes that we're deeply broken. Yes, individuals should be held accountable for their actions, but our fundamental goals as a society should always be to heal, help, and repair, to love and to treat with dignity and respect all those who are part of our community. We must radically and aggressively remain loyal and committed to the well-being of all, and especially those who we've deemed to have violated the social contract. We must begin to think in a more complex and nuanced manner about those who the state calls criminals, because at the end of the day, and I'm paraphrasing Dr. King, no document from human hands make these individuals any less our brothers and sisters. We all have an obligation and an incredible burden in these dynamic times to continue to strive to create and achieve a beloved community here in Oregon, to create a justice system that's rooted in dignity and compassion, humility, and respect. This is how we at OGRC are working to creating a beloved community. And this to me is the greatest lesson of what Bryan Stevenson's doing and through the stories that he shares in his book. We're seeking to inject the values of love and community into our justice system. Where we have normalized brutality, torture, and excessive punishment, we're seeking to expose these practices as contrary to the well-being of our society and something that's simply wrong and not normal. We're seeking to radically transform our justice system so when we ask the questions of how we're punishing and who we're incarcerating, we will no longer be ashamed. To achieve this change, it will take all of you and many more to accomplish this radical revolution in values, but I'm confident and optimistic and remain hopeful. As Bryan stated, quote, "We're all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, and a nation. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others. The closer we get to mass incarceration and the extreme levels of punishment, the more I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy, we all need justice, and perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace." I hope Bryan's book, movie, and work at the Equal Justice Initiative inspires you, and that through his stories, you were able to get proximate to the individuals who have gone through our criminal system. When we fully appreciate this history of white supremacy in our country and understand how mass incarceration is a manifestation of it, a system of social and racial control, then we can begin to see more clearly how individuals are more than the crime that they've been charged with or convicted of. That we can begin to clearly understand how all of our social systems and public officials are complicit in sustaining these harms. That we see that the attempts to reduce and simplify individuals to a particular action is the intention of this toxic value system. We then are able to open our hearts and move with compassion towards every individual. And it's through compassion, it is compassion that is the greatest threat to white supremacy. It's our enduring hope for the well-being of everyone in our community that will frustrate and abolish mass incarceration. I would encourage you, please keep getting proximate, stay hopeful, and act with great compassion as you move forward with all your acts and deeds. And thank you for your time this evening.
Thank you so much, Bobbin. And now we're going to move to the question and answer part of this event. So I'll just encourage people to type their questions into the chat. We already have a few here. So the first question is, I've read recent statistics about how the population of women in prison has risen exponentially in the last few years. Can you speak a little bit about what might be causing that rise and how that affects families, and especially families of color?
Yeah, the incredible increase in the incarceration of women from the 90s has outpaced the men by 3 times here in Oregon, and just nationally. It's a trend. You know, the phenomenal thing about it is the arrest rates for women have actually decreased. So what it means is that we are actually criminalizing more behaviors and sentencing women to longer sentences. Uh, it's not that women have gotten more criminal over the past 2 decades. We've just gotten more punitive as a society and criminalized more behaviors of women. And there is an incredible amount of gender issues that play out in the incarceration of women. You know, the tragedy is the disproportionate impact will be with women of color and their families. I think, you know, it's hard to state clearly just how destructive this is. When we think about the average age of the women that are going into incarceration, we most often see that being the age during childbearing years or pivotal years in which, that are important to children if they have children, of being a mother and raising children. And so I think in the most sort of sensational or extreme way, and I think this is an honest way of looking at it, when we began to look at the disproportionate impact that it has, especially on women of color, and they were removing them, especially during this important sort of economic period, but this childbearing period, this is a slow moving genocide that's happening. We are literally taking and removing and preventing populations from continuing. And this most plays out, I think, with the Black population, with the Native population, and other communities of color. This is something that we have to accept as the reality. On the flip side, what we see it with men, the removal of men of color, especially Black men, during this period for years, we have removed generations of leadership and community leaders as well. So what mass incarceration is doing is destroying communities. It is preventing the continuation of certain communities in our country. And I think that plays out most grotesque with the women's population. But, you know, the increase that we see of incarceration with women does not make any sense. I think when we look at the ideology of white supremacy and we look at that trilogy again, we're looking at control of sexuality and misogyny as being a central factor to white supremacy. So in many ways, that's an expectation or an expected result of mass incarceration, to see these populations are experiencing what we're seeing. So in very much it's in sync or consistent with that ideology. But also what I'll say is over the past 2 decades, what we've seen in the rise in incarceration rates of women has just been profound. And I think the impact is pretty incredible, especially as we talk about the family unit and family connection. I think we're beginning to see better conversations about the importance of keeping families together, even during incarceration, and creating systems that allow that. But, you know, what the pandemic has exposed over this past year is incredible strains on that, where people in prison have largely been disconnected from their community, from their loved ones. So those infrastructures and systems, any positive gains that we've made over the past years, I think have all been unwound, especially this past year. I don't know, we have a women's justice project, our director, Julia Yoshimoto. She could speak more, I think, eloquently about this issue. So, but I'm happy to direct additional resources or things if people have follow-up questions around it.
Thanks, Bobbin. The next question is, our current administration will not renew private prison contracts. How will that affect Oregon's prisons?
You know, not very much. Oregon is actually a state that doesn't have private prisons. So, that won't really do anything. You know, the Biden and his President Biden, by terminating that contract, just did it for federal prisons. So it's just going to be at the federal level. I think it's over 90%, but mass incarceration is at the state level. 90%, 95%, something like that, of the population that's incarcerated is at the state level. Only a very small percentage of individuals or of our incarcerated population exists at the federal level. So while I think this is an incredibly important symbol, it actually doesn't really affect very much at the state level or the sort of the system of mass incarceration. It does say, it is symbolic and important because mass incarceration is in part driven by sort of the extremes of capitalism. So there is an underlying profit, an industry that is profiting off of human suffering, essentially, and caging people. So there are contractors, that make uniforms, weapons, food, whatever it may be, that supply these prisons. And so when we began to start, and I hope this is the beginning of a conversation, a cultural pivot to beginning to address that profit motive that's driving this, I think that's a very important thing. And I think this is a first step in that direction by saying that we are not going to have for-profit prisons in the business of caging people at the federal level.
Okay, the next question is, can you speak about criminal justice systems in other countries that you feel are doing it right?
Yeah, I think, mass incarceration is really an American phenomenon. Like, it is something that was born out of, how this country is founded and that ideology of white supremacy. I mean, what we've seen is we've started looking more to Northern European countries like Norway and Sweden as models for how, when someone commits a crime, how we respond to it and how we create systems to be able to remove someone from society, but not actually disconnect them or harm them further. So I think there are examples, especially in the Northern European countries, that kind of show how we can think about incarceration differently, solely as the loss of liberty, but not the excessive additional punishments as, dehumanization, disconnection, basically being frozen in time for 10, 20, 30 years without any type of engagement or programming. So I think those are the countries that are looking at it. I mean, unfortunately, there's a wide diversity of detention systems that exist in this country, and many of them that we see, especially under authoritarian regimes, are pretty terrible. But as far as the total size and volume or scale, like, US is by far the biggest. But I think, this is one of those unfortunate things where US created this system of mass incarceration, and then because of the related infrastructure that sustains it, a lot of this stuff gets replicated or used in other countries. And so, it's an unfortunate, I think, circle that we're in where, countries then take what we're doing here and begin to implement it in their countries and ignore perhaps more restorative or more, systems that were sort of more, I don't want to say that existed prior to sort of like this invasion of like mass incarceration, the ideology of mass incarceration.
Okay, thanks, Bobbin. The next question is, how much impact does drug and alcohol use impact mass incarceration?
It's not, we can't really quantify that, but it is a major driver. I mean, and I think if we began to think of mass incarceration as a public health issue, then we began to ask ourselves a very different set of questions, because what we end up seeing is the vast majority of individuals that are coming into the system are brought to the system because of mental health issues, addiction issues, poverty-related issues, and poverty-related issues that impact other public health issues, like your own well-being. So when we talk about like drug and alcohol being a driver of mass incarceration, I think there's several ways to look at it. One, there are those individuals, that are caught up in the war of drugs, and, communities of color are disproportionately impacted by this, in which law enforcement is engaging in discriminatory practices and disproportionate kind of policing in communities, pretext around drugs, right? That's the whole war on drugs. But below that, we see a lot of harms that end up bringing people into the criminal justice system, what they get arrested for and convicted for. Those are things that are ultimately driven by trauma, generational trauma, violence within the household that are often, driven by drugs and alcohol. Theft, property theft is something that's typically driven by addiction issues. Even a lot of violence may be driven by drug and alcohol behavior and addiction issues. I mean, some of the clients that we work with, committed terrible, terrible crimes when they were very young. I work with a group of juvie lifers at one of our prisons, and they all committed murder when they were, 15, 16, and 17-year-olds. Almost all of them did it because addiction was a part of a component or involved in the circumstances of their life. I mean, there was additional trauma and other issues. But, one of the things that we've seen is people who have addiction issues, especially with like drugs like meth, it happens so quickly, and it can become so destructive and violent that is like the behaviors that drive it. So I guess to say if we had better social systems and better treatment programs in the community, or recognize that individuals, like one of the individuals that we work with, unfortunately, he went through severe meth addiction, committed a terrible harm, incarcerated basically for life. And he's served over 30 years. The truth is he'll never commit another harm ever again. The factors that led to his harm have all been corrected. He's recognizing, he understands it, he understands his triggers, but we're keeping him incarcerated because of an event that happened, when he was 17 years old or 18 years old, and, so this is a long-winded way of saying, like, yes, I think drug and alcohol contribute to a lot of our mass incarceration as far as like that drive human behavior. But I want to be very clear that mass incarceration itself is its own value system that punishes people, that intentionally punishes our community for these types of behaviors, or those that are on the margins that don't fit into what we sort of identify as people that are successful or anything like that. So, I guess I'm trying to do a careful dance and trying to separate the two, that I don't want to say mass incarceration is necessarily driven by drug and alcohol as much as mass incarceration is responding to those behaviors. And we of our society are using mass incarceration to respond to those behaviors.
Okay, thanks, Bobbin. The next question is, can you imagine a time when we could do away with incarceration altogether?
I think so, in the current sort of iteration that it exists in. I mean, I think the one thing that we should all, I think, be excited about is this was all human made. This means that we can create something different if we decide to. Like this is a choice that we've sort of implement. Like, we have made this decision to create society this way. We can always change it however we want. I think, society has never been absent of harms or violence or anything like that. But I think there are more restorative ways, more interventions that could, if we reframe the question away from public safety, which is something as an organization we're really trying to do, we're really trying to avoid this term of public safety or safety, because it creates a dichotomy, or this idea of something you have to keep yourself safe versus something you should fear. I think if we reframe the question of what actually makes our communities healthier and what promotes individual well-being, then I think we begin to think about a whole different set of solutions and interventions when people sort of engage in harms that we would deem criminal at this point. Now, there's always going to be individuals that will need to be removed from society for reasons, but we can envision that removal as being something very different than what would exist now. But that's only limited by our imagination and our will, and our willingness to, again, view everybody with compassion and engage with compassion first and foremost, and dignity. So yes, I think we can get there. I don't know what it looks like myself, but I would encourage everyone to exercise your imagination and use that muscle, because the more it's like anything else, the more we practice, the better we'll get at it. And we're just not practiced at it at this point as a society.
Okay, great, thanks. We had a question about the list of definitions that you went through, and it made me think of the question, do you have a book that you could recommend? It might be hard to recommend just one, but a book that you could recommend that would help us understand these big concepts.
Yeah, I think Ibram Kendi, he has a whole book on, I think, racist language in terms, I forget what it's called. I'm sure you could check it out from the Beaverton Library. Eric Ward, he's the executive director of Western State Center and a phenomenal speaker on white supremacy and white nationalism. So you could just Google search him and look up the YouTube videos. He's a phenomenal speaker, speaks quite eloquently about the differences between white supremacy, white nationalism, and the role anti-Semitism plays in all this. So those would be the two where I would start. If you're into more of like a movie, then The 13th, which is I think available on Netflix. It's a documentary, which is really phenomenal, that kind of talks through this connection as well.
That's great, thanks. So that we don't have any more questions, but we have a really interesting comment here that I'm just going to read out for you to kind of wrap things up. And you can definitely respond to it if you'd like before we do. It just says, Bobbin, thank you for telling the truth. We must tell the truth before we are able to move forward in regard to racial justice. Incarceration is not sustainable. Closing 3 small prisons reduces a budget, but does not address prison reform. We need more behavioral health and alternative incarceration designs integrated into the system. Communities with disparate populations need a place at the table to help make decisions. We need to be supported and empowered. We need communities to be given the resources necessary to help reduce incarceration and recidivism. Thank you for your work.
I mean, I think that's right. I think, one of the things I think that we're really trying to strive as an organization is to approach this as a values-based conversation, because it is about values. It's about confronting this ideology. I think too much in the past, criminal justice advocates, civil rights community have been too willing to acquiesce to the framing of the conversation from the sort of the dominant culture or those who have power, and trying to use that language and use that messaging as a way to move our issues instead of just standing up and saying what it is that we believe in. And so we always see, advocates trying to use the cost savings benefit, their return on investment, the fiscal savings to the state as an argument. We try to message things or over message things as a way not to just talk directly about the issues. And again, that goes back to the practice of our willingness to be just direct and honest about these issues and what it is that we're trying to do. Because ultimately, we only change this if we as a society, as a community and a state, embrace a radical transformation of values. And again, I think rooted in compassion and dignity and in love towards our fellow community members, and always trying to strive to understand from a well-being perspective what is going to make our communities thrive, both collectively but individually. Where are we going to allow the most amount of access and opportunities for individuals? Every individual should have the agency to be able to make a decision about how they want to participate. But society should not restrict, limit, or deny access based on arbitrary characteristics or immutable characteristics. It just doesn't make any sense. So I do think, on that comment, like, it's really, really important that that we recognize some of these like small, victories that are really good, but also continue to strive to create values change or a culture change, as opposed to, these reforms, because reforms imply changing the system, but not the values, but acknowledging that the system exists, but you can change components of the system. And what we really need to do is abolish white supremacy, confront white supremacy, frustrate white supremacy. Our theory is you frustrate mass incarceration, you abolish mass incarceration, you are attacking white supremacy, straight on. So I'm completely supportive and really believe wholesale that we be honest, open, and direct. We embrace the truth of our history. We accept our own place and complicitness and how we've sustained these harms. And then as we do that, I think the solutions will begin to reveal themselves. But until we do that truth-telling thing, we'll never get to the reconciliation part. So that would be my last comment, I guess.
Thank you so much, Bobbin, for such a thought-provoking discussion and for all the important work that you do. And thanks everybody for coming out tonight and for your support of One Book, One Beaverton. Have a great night.